So now we covered get static props and get static paths and get server-side props. And I hope it's clear what these functions do and why they exist. They allow us to fetch data for pre-rendering those pages so that we pre-render the pages with the data instead of without the data they might need. Now up to this point, we're only working with dummy data though, which is not actually fetched from anywhere. Instead, we have this dummy array, or in the case of the Meetup ID page here, actually hard-coded data in that return statement. And that's of course not realistic at all. Instead, we do have this add new meetup page here, which would allow us to enter data for a new meetup. And hence, we're now going to finish this app by adding a real backend with a real database where the data will be stored and from which we then fetch it. And this then also allows me to show you the last major Next.js feature which is added by Next to your React apps. Next.js makes it easy for us to build an API, a backend API, together with our front-end React app in the same project. For this, we can use another key Next.js feature called API routes. API routes are special routes, special pages, if you want to call it like this, which don't return HTML code, but which are instead about accepting incoming HTTP requests, also post, patch, put, delete requests, whatever you need, with JSON data attached to them, and which then might do whatever you need to do, for example, store data in a database, and then return JSON data. So you could say API routes allow you to build your own API endpoints as part of this Next project. And they will then be served by the same server as your Next app. Now to add API routes, you add a special folder in your Pages folder. And that's a folder named API. And just as the Pages folder has to be named Pages, this folder has to be named API. And it has to be in the Pages folder. Then Next.js will pick up any JavaScript files stored in there and turn those files into API routes, so into endpoints that can be targeted by requests and that should receive JSON and return JSON. Now in this API folder, you can then again add JavaScript files where the file names will act as path segments in the URL. For example, a new Meetup.js file again. Now here in the API folder. Now in those JavaScript files here, you then don't create a React component function. These API routes are not about defining, rendering, or returning React components. Instead, in there, we will define functions which contain server-side code, because API routes will only run on the server, never on the client. The code in them will never be exposed to the client, so we can also use credentials in API routes without compromising them. And those functions are then simply triggered whenever a request is sent to this route, so to /API/new meetup here. This would be the URL of this file. And if a request is sent to this URL, it will trigger the function which we have to define in this file. Now, often this function is named handler, but the name is up to you. The important thing is that it's exported. So we export this handler function here. And this function will receive a request and a response object. You might know this from Node.js and Express.js. The request object contains data about the incoming request. The response object will be needed for sending back a response. Now from that request object, we can get things like the headers or the request body, and also the request method through the method property here. This allows us to find out which kind of request was sent, and we could, for example, check if we are receiving a post request here. So if the request method is post, and we only execute the code in this if check if it is an incoming post request. For other kinds of requests, we don't do anything. So that would ensure that only post requests to this route would actually trigger this code in here. Then here we can get our data by accessing rec.body. The body field is another built-in field which contains the body of the incoming request, the data of the incoming request. And then we can do whatever we need to do. Now this here will be the endpoint for creating a new meetup. And therefore it's probably fair to expect that this data which we get contains a title, a meetup image, an address, and a description field. After all, it's our page, our project, and our API, so we can expect whichever data we need. We will then just have to make sure that we send the correct data when we do send a request to this API route later. But for the moment, I do indeed expect that we get some data out of this data, so out of this request body, and I'll use object destructuring here, and I expect to get a title, an image field, an address field, and a description field. So these are the 4 fields which I expect to get on the incoming request body. And then we can store them in a database, for example. And that's what we're going to do now.